goal to negotiate a brand new nuclear agreement with Iran. The Obama nuclear agreement was catastrophically dangerous. And President Biden wants nothing more than to re-enter a deal that is even worse than the Obama deal. In Vienna, Biden diplomats have been furiously bending over backwards to surrender to the Ayatollah. The same Ayatollah who, as a theocratic despot, regularly chants death to America and death to Israel. This administration wants nothing more than to give them hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions relief. Money that will inevitably be used, number one, to murder Americans. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. And number two, to develop nuclear weapons. Under this administration, we have seen Iran sponsoring terror across the globe. Under the Biden administration, we have seen Iran enriching uranium such that it may be only weeks away from being able to develop a nuclear weapon. Under the Biden administration, we have seen Iran evade the most significant sanctions and return to selling over 1 million barrels of oil a day. Our enemies are stronger today because of the weakness of this administration. And the negotiations in Vienna reveal the utter incoherence and absurdity of their foreign policy. Because this is a deal the Biden administration is preparing to announce that was negotiated by the Russians. Right now, the administration has discovered talking points that Putin is bad. This is after President Biden waived sanctions on Nord Stream 2, effectively inviting Russia to invade Ukraine. All the while in Vienna, it is the Russians who have been negotiating and brokering this deal between the Biden administration and the Ayatollah. And the only thing that has delayed announcement of the deal is in the last week, the Russians, unsurprisingly, went to the Biden administration and said, you're announcing all of these sanctions, you're of course going to hold us harmless in the Iran deal. This Iran deal, if and when it is announced, will be a massive win for Vladimir Putin, because the Biden administration has been eager to tell Putin and tell the Ayatollah, of course, we will have a carve-out for the Iran deal on Russia sanctions, which means Putin will make billions in oil and gas transactions, in nuclear transactions, and in weapons transactions. Putin wants to be the leading arms dealer to the Ayatollah. And so the Biden administration is incoherently announcing sanctions on Russia while simultaneously creating a massive subsidy for Russia. This makes no sense. If you want to understand how little sense it makes, just talk to any of Iran's neighbors in the Middle East. Ironically, Obama may have retroactively deserved the Nobel Peace Prize that he was awarded, because he managed to do something that heretofore had been impossible. He united the Israelis and the Arabs. And all he had to do was negotiate a deal that would lead inevitably to Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And suddenly, nations that had been enemies for millennia came together and said, this is truly insane, standing by and allowing the Ayatollah to have nuclear weapons. If this deal goes forward, it will have no effect unless and until it is submitted to the Senate as a treaty and ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. If it were actually a good deal, it should be able to get ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. The chances that Biden will submit it as a treaty are 0.0%. Under existing statute, he's required to submit it for congressional approval. You may see the Biden administration try to stiff Congress even on that. But if this administration tries to ram through a terrible deal, In Congress, you could expect Congress to do everything possible to resist a deal that gives Iran and the Ayatollah the resources to develop a nuclear weapon. And you can rest assured that on January 20th, 2025, the next presidential administration, which I believe will be a Republican administration, will rip to shreds whatever terrible deal Biden gives away to Putin and the Ayatollah in Vienna. If, God forbid, the Ayatollah gets a nuclear weapon, the odds are far too high that we may discover in the skies of Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles, when a theocrat chants death to America and death to Israel, we should take those threats seriously. Senator Risch.
Well, thanks much. Let me put this in perspective a little bit. You know, we usually talk about nuclear weapons in very subjective terms and theoretical terms. There are 7 countries on the planet that have nuclear weapons, 7 admitted. This is a situation where, again, we don't talk about it much. They're strategic weapons, and everybody knows that that assured mutual destruction is what happens if somebody presses the button. So they really are talked about more theoretically than anything else. But in the last 10 days, we have seen a direct threat by a nuclear-powered country against the United States of America, and a threat to actually use nuclear weapons on us. We all heard, all of you heard, Putin say that if indeed we did anything to interfere in the Ukraine, that we would see death and destruction and the kind of harm here in the United States that this country has never seen before. He was talking about nuclear weapons, of course. That puts this in perspective. When a country has nuclear weapons, the stakes are entirely different. And obviously, you have to treat them differently. Each country has to take the threat of nuclear power seriously. And if unreasonable people are in possession of nuclear weapons, this is where you get. So, the magnitude of what we're talking about here, of having another country, another bad country, have nuclear weapons, is a colossal problem for the world, and particularly a colossal problem for its enemies, of which we are, of course, listed. Look, any dispute can be settled by 2 parties if there's 2 things present. You only need 2 things. Number 1, you need a common objective, and number 2, you need to have parties acting in good faith. You have neither with the Iranians. Their objective is to have a nuclear weapon. Our objective is, and the world's objective is, that they do not have a nuclear weapon. Now, they will do what they have to do to get there. Time means nothing to them. This is a population that's been around for thousands of years. 10 years, 15 years, 100 years doesn't mean anything to them, as long as they can get to their objective and have a nuclear weapon. And secondly, they need to be acting in good faith. Look, I don't speak Farsi. If I did, I doubt I could use the words good faith. I don't know that they exist, because I have never seen good faith on the part of the Iranians. So what do we do about this? Well, the first thing we need to do about this is walk away from this. As Senator Cruz said, it is absolutely stunning that this deal is being negotiated by 2 of our worst enemies on the planet. You got the Iranians and you got the Russians. They won't even let the Americans in the room. Would any of you sign a deal or go into negotiations where they wouldn't let you in the room when they were negotiating? These 2 are negotiating the deal. Our people are out in the hall at the kids' table looking through a keyhole to see what's going on in there. This is not right. What should we do? We should walk. This doesn't need to be done right now, and particularly, it doesn't need to be done when we have the problems going on that we have in the Ukraine. We should walk. Mr. President, you're the only one in America doing business with the Russians. Stop doing business with the Russians. Don't have them negotiating for us. Walk on this deal.
Senator Barrasso.
Well, it does seem like we're reliving the nightmare of the Obama-Biden administration. You have Russia invading Ukraine. You have highest gas prices ever, and we have the White House pursuing a bad deal with Iran, right where we were with Obama and Biden. We should not go back into a deal with Iran. We got out of that. We should never go back to a deal with Iran. My colleague spoke about the negotiation and how this deal has been put together. It is the Russians who are doing the negotiations on behalf of the United States. You turn on the TV, the radio, anything, you see what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. How in the world can we allow them to be negotiating on our behalf? And what did the Russian envoy talk about this negotiation? This is his quote. He said, Iran got much more than it could expect. Much more. Well, why do you think it got much more? Because the Russians made sure Iran got much more, and now they're bragging about how they took the United States to the cleaners. This is going to be massive money to Iran and money, as Senator Cruz said, to Russia. We know that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. The last time they got money, pallets full of cash, they used it for terrorism. And what's the administration doing now? They're talking about buying oil from Iran. Shut off Russia. Where are we going to go? Not to the United States. Oh, no, we wouldn't want to use American oil. Let's take a look at Venezuela and Iran. The Secretary of Transportation, Buttigieg, said so just the other day. We'll do what we need to do to get the oil, and Iran is the option. No deal with Iran is a good deal ever.
Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Ted. Folks, I said this yesterday, and I'm going to say it again today. I don't understand the president's foreign policy. I don't get it. I really don't. It is truly insane that President Biden and his administration are working with Russia. Russia, this is the country with tanks running over Ukraine right now, killing innocent civilians, children, women, people that we care about. And yet they're using those Russians to negotiate a deal with yet another one of our near-peer adversaries, Iran. And it's not just Russia who's negotiating with the U.S. We can also talk about the Chinese Communist Party as well. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. I'll throw in there as well, the Biden administration just released another several $1 billion to the Taliban and the Haqqani terrorist network in Afghanistan. Who are we enabling? This administration continues to give dollars and advantages to everyone who is our near-peer adversary. And we are allowing the Russians to negotiate with Iran on a nuclear deal. Now, the Iranian regime's funding of terrorism, it sure hasn't changed much, not over the last few decades. They still are the world's largest sponsor, state sponsor of terrorism. I will remind you that the Iranians were the ones that were manufacturing many of the IEDs that killed and maimed American soldiers in Iraq. That's the Iranians, folks. We can't ever expect them to act in good faith. They have continued to enrich uranium through the years. They did that while they were in the Obama-Biden nuclear agreement. They continued to do it. They said they wouldn't, but they did. The JCPOA has always been a bad deal. It's still a bad deal today, especially with the Russians involved. And again, as stated by so many, the timing is especially dangerous right now as the Russians have invaded Ukraine. And instead of unleashing our own energy production here in the United States, we are turning to, again, our adversaries. And we are giving open consideration to lifting sanctions on Iranian oil instead of producing right here at home and putting Americans to work. This is unbelievable. And just as Senator Risch said, Mr. President, walk away. Walk away from this deal. We have got to do the right thing, and empowering Iran is not the right thing. Empowering Russia by allowing them to serve as negotiators to this deal is not the right thing. We need to take back our standing in the world, and allowing these adversaries to walk all over us is not the right thing for the United States of America, nor is it the right thing for our allies and our partners. Thank you.
Senator Hagerty, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. Senator Cruz, thank you for putting this conference on. I'd just like to hit on another point that the Biden administration has brought home to America, and that is inflation. And perhaps the biggest cause of this inflation is the war that the Biden administration has waged on American energy. What we've seen is a dramatic increase in inflation. It's hurting every American. And now what we see, as Russian tanks roll into Ukraine, gas prices moving even further. What's the Biden administration offering to address this massive inflation, to address the pain that every American is feeling at the pump? Well, let's work with our adversaries. Let's send a team to Venezuela. Let's send a team to Iran. Let's cut a deal with the Iranians to put their oil on the market, with the Venezuelans to put their oil on the market. What we have is an administration that would rather deal with international killers than with American drillers. This, my friends, has to stop, and we could stop it tomorrow. All we need to do is have this administration come out and clearly state that we're going to reopen the Keystone XL pipeline, that we're going to get back in the energy business, that we're going to become energy independent again, that we're going to remove this massive lever that Vladimir Putin has over the American economy, this lever that's pushing us into the arms of Iran, that's pushing us into the arms of Maduro in Venezuela. As my colleagues have said, this makes no sense whatsoever. We need to turn this deal in Iran down tomorrow. We need to get back into the energy business today. Thank you.
Senator Hogan.
The negotiation that the Biden administration is undertaking in Iran is fundamentally flawed. Senator Risch, Senator Cruz, and others have explained exactly why. It is absolutely fundamentally flawed. How do you negotiate with someone who is content to negotiate for as long as it takes for them to build a bomb while you're conducting the negotiation? This is structurally, fundamentally flawed. Not only are our negotiators not even at the table, they're negotiating with somebody who has no incentive to make a deal other than a deal that solely benefits them, that solely benefits Iran. Back in 2013, we passed Kirk-Menendez, biting sanctions. We passed a law that would allow the president, then President Obama, to put the severest sanctions in place on Iran so that they could not sell their oil. Once you put those sanctions in place with no exceptions, then you sit down and negotiate with Iran. And not from the kiddies table. You're in the room with them. Now when they're under pressure, when the pressure's on Iran, when they can't sell their oil, when their economy is falling apart and their people take to the streets and go after their leaders, when there's real pressure on them so they have an incentive to negotiate, that's when you negotiate. That's the structural criteria that you have to create to have some semblance, some chance of success. Compare that to the situation today. The Biden administration has again backed off the sanctions, taking the pressure off Iran, and then enters into a negotiation where Russia's leading the negotiation and our negotiators aren't in the room? What incentive does Iran have to get to any kind of reasonable negotiation? First, they can negotiate for as long as they want and just keep building the bomb, which is what they're doing. And if they ever get to an agreement, it's going to be a deal that they agree to because there's no pressure on them because the sanctions aren't in place. So if it's a good deal, they'll take it. Otherwise, they'll keep negotiating and building the bomb. That's what's going on. And then you add to it that this administration, instead of saying, hey, we're going to produce all the oil and gas we can, and oh, by the way, we have the best environmental standards in the world, we're going to produce all the oil and gas we can here to stop the inflation that's going on in this country and to help our allies. They go around to Iran and to Venezuela and to OPEC instead of saying we're going to produce it here. That's the wrong approach. And the people of this country know it's the wrong approach. And we need to continue to put the pressure on to change that approach and get the right kind of approach, to get the administration going the right direction, whether it's dealing with Iran, whether it's dealing with this, with the inflation challenge we have, whether it's producing more energy in this country, whether it's supporting the valiant people who are fighting in Ukraine.
Senator Young.
I thank members of our media for being here today. It's, of course, a very dangerous time for our country. It's a very dangerous time for the world. China continues to threaten its neighbors. There's a war against Vladimir Putin's Russia occurring in Eastern Europe, and the Iranians continue to terrorize their neighbors and develop nuclear capability. Amidst all of this, I am here, and I know my colleagues are here, in the spirit of praying that the President makes wise decisions, that he keeps us safe and secure and advances safety and security around the globe. And as it relates to the Iran deal, it's my fervent belief that no deal is better than a very, very bad deal. What would such a bad deal look like? It would be a deal that shortens the time for Iran's breakout nuclear capability, that endangers our friends in Israel, that destabilizes the entire Middle East and probably beyond. That's the sort of deal that I understand is being contemplated right now. Yes, Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons has to be countered. All of us agree with that. My constituents agree with that. But so should Iran's ability to terrorize its neighbors, to export the most horrific form of terror around the region and beyond. Relaxing any sanctions and removing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's designation as a terror group would be akin to pouring gasoline on this situation. There should be no doubt whatsoever in our minds that Iran will use these additional resources that evidently are being offered to them to support terror groups around the region. Groups like the Houthis in Yemen, groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. This deal that the Biden administration has negotiated alongside the likes of Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Communist Party is already being described as a significant victory for both of those countries. This deal will bring great power competition to the Middle East while paving the way to an enriched and nuclear-armed Iran, the leading state sponsor of global terrorism. Again, no deal is better than a very, very bad deal.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. And, you know, Senator Ernst and Senator Barrasso talked about a little bit of history and the context here. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into that because I think it's really important and doesn't get talked about nearly enough. In 2005 and 2006, I was a Marine Corps staff officer for the commander of U.S. Central Command, General Abizaid. And at that time, a new and very deadly weapon, the explosively formed penetrator, was appearing on the Iraq battlefield. The estimates are that these EFPs, as they're called, killed over 600 American soldiers, killed, and over 2,000 American soldiers wounded. Although the Iranians, Foreign Minister Zarif, publicly stated at that time they had nothing to do with these weapons, of course, they were lying, as they always do. The terrorist leaders in Iran were actually the ones who developed these weapons and were providing them to Iraqi Shia militias, wounding and killing over 2,000 of America's best and brightest. This is recent history. And yet, in my time in the U.S. Senate, I have never heard one of my Democratic colleagues or one member of the Biden administration, or Obama administration for that matter, mention it once. Not once. Instead, their focus has always been about the need to get back into the JCPOA and lately about lifting sanctions on Iranian oil. You've heard it from my colleagues here, but trust me, what we're saying is what the American people support. The Biden administration needs to stop begging brutal dictators for oil. We need to produce more here by our workers, and we should not be filling up the coffers of terrorist regimes like Iran with money from America when we purchase their oil. They should not be returning to this deal with this brutal regime and its leaders, a regime that literally has the blood of American soldiers on its hands recently, and a regime whose leaders continue to say they want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. I think we've learned when leaders say things like this, we should take them seriously.
We're now happy to take questions.
Senator Cruz, you talked about congressional review and trying to ensure that that actually happens. What mechanisms do you have at your disposal to ensure that? Is it INARA from 2015? Is it some new legislation? Can you explain to us what that might be?
So under the explicit terms of INARA, any agreement can't go into effect unless it is submitted to Congress for approval. And so the Biden administration needs to comply with that law. My understanding is there's some creative lawyers at the State Department that are trying to find ways around that law. But we're a nation of laws, and the right way to do this would be a treaty. And if it were actually a substantively good deal, you should be able to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree with it. But the reason Biden doesn't want to do it as a treaty is because this is a deal negotiated between Russia and Iran. It's a terrible deal for America. It's a terrible deal for Israel. It's a terrible deal for the world. And so there would be no prayer at getting 2/3 support.
Got some new legislation, too, I might mention, Ted.
Sure.
I'd like to also mention that 38 of my colleagues here, myself and 37 other colleagues, are all co-sponsors of the Iran Sanctions Review Act of 2021. It takes the same language that was used with the Russian CAATSA Act that was passed with bilateral support back in 2017, substitutes the word Russia with Iran. Any sanctions relief that's provided to Iran, and this deal will have sanctions relief in it, must come to the Senate, must come to the House for review. That's what we'd like to see done, and we are, again, the majority of Republicans in our conference are sponsoring this act. So there's another avenue that we can take as well to broaden the reach. Again, as Senator Cruz mentioned, this should come as a treaty. If not, INARA should work. Failing that, my legislation will help address it.
One more point on INARA. So again, just for a little bit of history, I know you all know it, but it's worth repeating. Even under INARA with the original JCPOA, a agreement of that magnitude in terms of national security, I think it's the first time in U.S. history that it had a bipartisan majority opposing it. Bipartisan majority in the House, bipartisan majority in the Senate opposed the original JCPOA. So again, this wasn't even supported by the vast majority of Republicans or Democrats the first time around, and they better bring it to the Congress because, as Ted said, that's the rule of law. I agree it should be viewed as a treaty. But remember, the original JCPOA had a bipartisan majority in both houses that were actually opposed to it.
Well, and just to follow up on what Senator Sullivan just said, you know, the Ayatollah has been publicly calling on the Biden administration to make commitments that any agreement, any terrible agreement they sign, must be permanent, must last to successor administrations. And the Biden administration has expressed a willingness to make that promise. There's just one small wrinkle. It doesn't have the constitutional authority to do so. There are two ways, and only two ways under our Constitution, that our government makes a binding promise. The first is a treaty signed by the President and ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. The second is through legislation passed by both houses of Congress and signed into law by the President. The Biden administration doesn't purport to do either one with this, which means there is a reason that President Trump was able to tear up this disastrous deal, because Obama, like Biden, tried to do it outside the constitutional structure. And if Biden does the same, he can rest assured it will have the same fate. The next Republican president, whoever that may be, will end any terrible deal that this administration enters. Yeah.
So the Biden administration has said that regarding domestic oil production, that there are 9,000 leases that have yet to be used, that production is near record levels. Both Republicans and Democrats have called for this ban on Russian oil. Does industry have some responsibility at some point to increase production on their own? Or what would you like the Biden administration to do in that regard?
Well, President Biden and the Biden White House's talking points on energy are both inane and contradictory. The Biden White House maintains that decreasing supply does not impact price. If you look at how Joe Biden started his presidency, he started it with a war on U.S. oil and gas. You know, President Biden tried to say this week, the increase in gas prices is due to Putin. I understand the Russians are the favorite talking point for Democrats. We spent 4 years under Trump hearing Democrats say Russia, 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 and now the Biden White House wants to say all of the disaster of inflation, that's Russia's fault too. The one problem is the facts. On day one as president, Joe Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline. He killed 11,000 high-paying jobs, including 8,000 union jobs. On day one, he halted all new leases on federal lands, both onshore and offshore. And shortly thereafter, he halted development of ANWR, the incredibly rich, small portion of Alaska that has vast petroleum reserves. Not only that, he unleashed federal regulators to descend like locusts on oil and gas producers in the United States. And the results were exactly what they intended, which is U.S. production went down. In 2019, America became energy independent, thanks to common sense principles enacted with a Republican Congress, and under President Trump, we were energy independent and a net energy exporter. Last year, under 2021, we lost that status. We are now a net energy importer, thanks to the disaster of the Biden energy policies. As the rig count plummeted, our production plummeted, and when supply drops, prices skyrocket. Before Putin ever invaded Ukraine, gasoline prices in the United States had risen 48%. And their latest talking point is there's all these wonderful permits that just the oil companies, for whatever reason, don't want to drill upon. Now, I understand that the White House's talking points are written by an 18-year-old intern who's taking freshman socialism. But it would be good to have someone who's actually worked in the private sector and has some awareness of how energy is produced. Energy producers will drill for oil and gas wherever it is profitable, wherever it is viable. Many of those permits are not being drilled because if you got a natural gas well that you're trying to drill, you have to have a pipeline to carry the gas from the well to its end users. And the Biden administration is also freezing pipelines. You've got to have an environment where those resources can be profitably developed. I'll give you something Joe Biden could do today to both hurt Russia and affect prices. There are 6 applications pending right now in the Biden administration to export liquid natural gas. They're sitting on all 6 of them. At the State of the Union, I pulled Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, aside and said, Tony, if you want to do something to really hurt Putin, tomorrow Biden should go on national television and approve all 6. And have the Europeans start signing long-term energy contracts with American producers instead of Russia. There is nothing we could do that would more fundamentally weaken Putin's standing at home and limit his ability to wage war than cut off the revenue he makes from selling oil and natural gas to Europe and others.
Let me take.
Let me give an
we all
example.
want a bite of
Let me
this.
give an example in my state. My state, we were producing 1.5 million barrels a day. Just a little while ago, 1.5 million barrels a day. We're down to 1.1 million barrels a day. That's just for North Dakota. That's 400,000 barrels a day that we don't have because of all the restrictions, the regulatory burdens, all the things that Senator Cruz just talked about, okay? And that's just one state. Now apply that to Texas and New Mexico, Alaska, so clearly without all these restrictions and regulations, we could, take the handcuffs off. We can produce a lot more gas and oil. Or how about the fact that we're flaring gas? In my state right now, we have stranded natural gas that we have to flare because we can't get the gathering systems and the permits to get that to market, or the LNG facilities. All these things have an impact right now as well as in the medium and longer term. How it defies common sense that at a time with energy prices spiking, $4.25 a gallon is the average today, and it's going up here at home. Our allies need oil and gas. Instead of saying, hey, let's empower American ingenuity to produce this oil and gas here where we have the best environmental stewardship in the country, and instead he's going around to Maduro in Venezuela or Iran or anywhere else. I mean, it's unbelievable. So that's what we're saying. That's what the American people know should be done right now. It's common sense. The Biden administration needs to change course, and let's get going on producing oil and gas, producing energy in this country.
Let me take it. Wait, before you do that, let me take. You guys are smarter than this, okay? I know you are. I really know you are. I can't believe you let them get away with that kind of baloney that they're peddling. I'm going to use just one narrow part of it that the American people will understand. Prior to the Ukrainian war, in the last 2 weeks in February, there were zero Russian oil came in. They shut the private sector shut it off themselves. Said we're not going to do it. Prior to that, we were bringing in 600,000 barrels a day from Russia into the United States of America. Prior to them cutting it off in February, I went up, as did my friends here, and watched Biden get sworn in on the front steps. An hour later, he walked into the president's room. He took his papers and started signing executive orders. And one of them he shut down the Keystone Pipeline. 700,000 gallons a day. Would you rather have, 700,000 barrels a day. Would you rather have 600,000 come in from Russia that you're paying Russian for, getting them rich, or would you rather have 700,000 barrels a day coming in from Canada and having our workers be employed by that? This is outrageous, absolutely outrageous for them to try to point the finger and say, oh, this is somebody else's fault. It's the Biden administration's fault. You guys are smarter than this. I know you are.
Let me jump on this pile here, because it's actually really important. First, I agree with Ted on the, high school intern on these talking points. So actually, by the way, when you look at leases, I would love it if you guys looked at where the vast majority of federal leases in the first year of the Biden administration went to. Over half went to one state. My state, his state, his state. No, New Mexico. Secretary of Interior from New Mexico. You might want to look into that one. Very interesting to me. But the way it works, and the White House should know it, but maybe they don't, you issue a lease, and then there's still tons more permits and requirements that you have to get from the federal government. It's not just one lease and it's all good. And on almost every one of these in Alaska, we have to get permission to build what's called an ice road, because as John Hoven's saying, we have these super high environmental standards. Every move, we have to get permission and permitted on federal lands, and they are blocking it. In year one, this administration has issued 22 executive orders or executive actions solely focused on Alaska. 22! Could you imagine if Joe Biden were still a senator and a Republican administration came in and issued in year one 22 executive orders focused on puny little Delaware? He would be on the floor raising hell every day. This is exactly what they're doing. They are nickel and diming our resource development sector, our energy sector, to try to get them to stop producing. And they've been successful. And my state, unfortunately, has been ground zero. See it almost every day.
Just quickly, can I ask? So, some Democrats have expressed interest in ramping up some domestic production in the near term, as to transition. Even Elon Musk, I believe, has talked a little bit about this. Is there some sort of deal, an arrangement with the administration, a guarantee? I don't know what it would be, but we're in an extraordinary situation with the war in Ukraine. Is there something to be done here that stops short of what you're asking for?
Yeah, have them get out of the way.
Look,
Americans can do it.
I hope so. There should be. There should be, and I would encourage each of you to ask questions to the Democrats like that. I can tell you their talking points. You got a bunch of Democrat senators, notably those that happen to be on the ballot in November, who claim they support U.S. energy production. But I'll tell you, we had votes last year. We had a vote in Vote-A-Rama. You guys remember, we were here at 5 in the morning. We had Vote-A-Rama. We had a vote to reopen the Keystone Pipeline. And it passed. It got more than 50 votes. Several Democrats voted for it. And I'm sure they were trying to get headlines back in their states. Democrat votes for the Keystone Pipeline. And if you remember, we voted until 5 in the morning. The very last amendment that was taken up was an amendment by Chuck Schumer. And it's an amendment called the Wraparound Amendment that repealed every single amendment that had been adopted during the night, including reopening the Keystone Pipeline. So you got a couple of Democrats on Keystone can say they voted for it right before they voted against it. Apparently they're following John Kerry. We would love to have Democrats stand for domestic energy production. But the Biden White House has expressed zero interest. Think how extraordinary it is that they send a Biden official to Venezuela and they're negotiating with Iran. What is going through your brain when you think, I'd rather have the Ayatollah producing energy and making billions than have jobs and low-cost energy produced in America that's better for the environment? It makes no sense. So we would welcome Democrats working with us. By the way, any Democrat was welcome to come to this press conference. You notice that when it comes to a nuclear Iran, the Democrats are silent.
The question I'd ask is, what price does it take? What price for a gallon of gas does it take for the administration to take the handcuffs off and let us produce energy here at home? What does it take? We're at $4.25 nationally now. And remember, that's just what you pay at the pump. Think of all the other products that need energy to be made. So it's driving inflation across the board. So we're at $4.25 now. So start tracking it. This is going to happen. This administration is going to have to reverse course at some point and let us produce oil and gas here in this country. What's it going to take? It's $4.25 now. So you guys start tracking it.
All right, last question.
Senator Cruz, you mentioned in your remarks that since Biden administration started, Iran is selling more oils.
Yep.
So if the talk is now is let's buy oil from Iran and Venezuela with no deal, and they are still selling their oils, why even Iran should be about to go to a kind of a deal? And one other question, Senator Risch, if you may, comes November 2022, and if the House, if the Congress is in the Republicans' control, what happens to the deal before getting to the January 2025?
So look, you ask a very good question. The Biden administration has already made so many unilateral concessions to Iran that Iran is benefiting. The best thing that ever happened to the Ayatollah was Joe Biden's becoming president. By the way, the best thing that ever happened to Vladimir Putin was Joe Biden becoming president. And tragically, the best thing that ever happened to communist China was Joe Biden becoming president. All of our enemies are growing stronger. We don't know what is in the deal. We know that this administration is desperate to cut a deal. We know that they're so desperate they asked Russia to negotiate the deal for them. Pause and think for a second just how much you want a deal if you go to Russia and say, will you be our trusted intermediaries? So I don't know how many billions of dollars this deal gives them. The last deal, they put $1.7 billion in cash in unmarked bills in pallets on airplanes and flew them in the dead of night to give to the Ayatollah. My assumption is this deal is much, much worse. More money. And Iran is also demanding lifting all sanctions on weapons, on ICBMs, on the tools that it can use to wage terror on its neighbors and to wage terror on America. And apparently the Biden administration wants to be the #1 funder of Iranian terrorism. It makes no sense whatsoever. And the American people know that, and as bad as Iran is now, a nuclear Iran, they're one of two scenarios of a nuclear Iran. There is a chance, nobody knows how high the chance, but a real chance that a nuclear Iran would use a nuclear weapon. It's one of the few regimes on earth that might use a nuclear weapon. You think about most regimes. Kim Jong-un in North Korea is megalomaniacal and dangerous, But the one thing we know about him is he wants to stay in power, which means maybe some rational deterrence is possible. With a theocratic zealot like the Ayatollah, who glorifies death and suicide. Look, the Ayatollah knows if he used a nuclear weapon against Israel or America, the result would be catastrophic. It could well cost millions of lives that he targets and millions of lives in Iranians in what followed. The problem with a theocratic religious zealot, he may be willing to make that exchange. We shouldn't want to roll the dice to find out if he means it when he says death to America. And by the way, every year Iran celebrates Death to America Day. It is a holiday in Iran. It is the anniversary of Iran taking Americans hostage. And they celebrate dancing in the streets. That's the worst case scenario. Here's the best case scenario. Iran has nuclear weapons, doesn't use it, starts a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East. The Saudis get nuclear weapons. The Emiratis get nuclear weapons. All their neighbors get nuclear weapons. And the Iranians use nuclear weapons to be even more aggressive, funding terrorists like the Houthis and Hezbollah because they feel that the nuclear weapons give them an insurance policy that no one can mess with them. That's the best case scenario. Any of those scenarios is a disaster. And we'll close out by giving an opportunity for what I believe will be Chairman Risch in just a few short months to answer your question about how Chairman Risch and the rest of Congress would view these things.
A first-year law student will tell you that first-year law student will tell you that the Constitution is crystal clear. The Founding Fathers were really smart. They said an agreement with a foreign country is so important that 2/3 of the Senate has got to ratify it. That's what needs to be done here. That's how it should be submitted. What kind of shenanigans they'll use to get there, I can't tell you come November, but we'll see what November brings. Thanks much. Thank you all for coming today.